With How Do You Live, or The Boy and the Heron, finally being released in US theaters, I have now been able to access and view every Hayao Miyazaki movie. While I haven't seen every Ghibli film yet, I have seen everything from the main man himself, which is why today I'm going to be ranking all of his movies from worst to best, in my personal opinion of course. Now, when I say worst to best, there is kind of an asterisk there because, well, I don't think Miyazaki has actually made a bad movie per se. Even my least favorite film by him is something that I can respect a lot as a film, so being placed low on the list isn't going to mean that I think the film is bad. Miyazaki just has a lot of really great films, and some of them are just better than others. I also want to clarify that this is all just my opinion, and a lot of you are not going to agree with me on some of these placements. So if you see something you disagree with, please hear me out first. Or just remember that this is all subjective, and I'm not trying to convince you that my opinion is right. So let's get started with number 12, and the main reason I tried to warn you guys about my placements, because in last place we have Howl's Moving Castle. See, I've already gained a few dislikes here just in the first installment, but I'm going to say it. I did not care for Howl's Moving Castle. I know this is one of Ghibli's most beloved and popular films ever, so this is an unpopular opinion, but I'm sorry, this is my least favorite Miyazaki movie. It's not even particularly close either. This has been my opinion on the film since I first tried watching it, and I say tried because, well, it took me a while to actually get through this film in its entirety. I tried to engage, and I really wanted to love this film as much as so many others, but this just never gave me that spark. I could never get invested in the characters, and while the score and visuals are breathtaking as always, some of the best in the entire company, something about this film just could not hit. It just didn't click with me. It's weird because I don't think this is a bad movie. It's well made and still has all the charm that you'd expect from Miyazaki and Ghibli, but I also just didn't really like it. I had a bit of an empty feeling watching it. I didn't dislike it, but I also just felt very tapped out. By the halfway point, it gets more apparent that the pacing is just a little all over the place, and I don't find anyone in the cast to be anything special. Characters really drive Ghibli for me, but I couldn't really connect with either Howl or Sophie. So yeah, I can't really say I see what everyone else sees in this film, but that doesn't mean I think it's bad. That's all I can really say about Howls though. I don't have any strong feelings about it, which is why it's in last place for me. I just don't feel anything for this film. So let's just move on before I make anyone else mad. Next up we have Lupin III, Castle of Cagliostro. So next up we have Miyazaki's real directorial debut, which is his spin on the Lupin III franchise, and it's actually pretty good. Yeah, from this point onward, I still like all of the movies I'm listing. The main reason why this film in particular is ranked so low is actually a couple of reasons, and they're rather simple ones. For one, I'm not well versed in Lupin III in any way. I was completely unfamiliar with the character and his mythos before watching this, and well, I still am. I think this is a good introduction, and I definitely am interested in checking out more Lupin material, but that's just one of the reasons this film doesn't hit me in any special way. I don't really know anything about these characters. I'd also say this is the most safe or standard film in Miyazaki's catalog. It's a pretty standard story structure and plot, and there's nothing you've never seen before. It's all just pretty unremarkable. That isn't to say that's necessarily a bad thing, since I don't think this film was trying to break any new ground, but when compared to every other movie this guy has made, it's just not above the others. This would be a lot of filmmakers' best films, but for Miyazaki, it's on the lower end, and that's completely fine. I still liked it a lot. Lupin is very fun, the animation is wonderful and has that very early Miyazaki charm that the later films don't really have. The animation is wonderful, expressive, and fluid, and the action is well drawn out too, with some really cool and fun espionage sequences that I can always appreciate. I do wish the side cast was a little more involved since I didn't really care for anyone other than Lupin, but overall, I still had a fun time. So, moving on to our next film in the ranking, we have Castle in the Sky. Yeah, this one is probably also gonna grind some gears, but let me say this one more time. I do like this movie. It's just not better than the other films on this list to me. A lot of stuff I said about the previous film kinda applies here. This is a good movie and I had fun with it, but nothing about it has any real deep personal connection with me. It's well made and has that early charm as all Ghibli movies do, and I think the adventure and world building in here are some of the best in any Miyazaki film. But I don't know. There isn't that much for me to say. I mean, I like the main cast. Pazu and Cheetah are very likable and worth following along. I wasn't like super invested in them, but they were very charming, and that's more than enough to keep me on board. Everyone else was just a little, I don't know, forgettable. I also think the villain kinda blows. He's pretty lame, and while I get villains are supposed to be bad people that you don't root for, his presence is just underwhelming and tiring, especially when it comes to Cheetah. It's just weird. Like, this film has some of Ghibli's best and most iconic moments, and I do think it's a great film, but once again, there just isn't a whole lot for me to talk about personally. I watched it, thought it was good, then just kinda moved on. I don't really think about this film at all. I probably would think of it differently if I saw it when I was younger, but even the Ghibli films I first watched as an adult have a lot more that speak to me personally than this. At one point I wanted to make a video on this film, but I just didn't because I realized I don't have any strong thoughts about it. So yeah, that's Castle in the Sky. Let's just move on now to our next spot, Ponyo. A lot of people will think this should be in last place, but I don't care. I enjoy Ponyo. I love Ponyo, in fact. I already made a video on this movie, kinda, and about how I think it's the perfect kids movie. And I stand by that. My opinion hasn't changed. This movie is full of charm and whimsy while also having some of the best and most sincere messages for children in media. I did watch this movie as a kid. It was my first Ghibli movie and my first anime movie in general, so there is a bit of bias here, but that's also the case for any review and ranking ever, so yeah. I have more of a soft spot for this film than the previous spots, and it's kind of clear to see why. I love the color work in here, primarily because it feels almost like a children's coloring book at times, which is another reason why I have the view that I have on it. In terms of stylistic choices, this is probably the most unique Miyazaki film, which is another thing that I can appreciate. This film is just very unapologetically childish, and I love it for that. Ponyo and Sosuke are characters that I believe many filmmakers and writers should take notes on when writing child protagonists, and I also think the ending is one of the most heartwarming in all of film. It's not perfect, and it's obviously not my number one, but I admire this film a lot, which is why it's placed as high as it is. I don't want to talk too much about it since I already made a whole video on Ponyo, so I'll just leave it off by saying, I don't care what you have to say, Ponyo absolutely slaps. So let's wrap this segment up and move on to our next spot on the list, Porco Rosso. What can I say? This movie is a ton of fun. I enjoyed it all the way through, and it literally never got boring at any point. It is shorter than most Ghibli movies, which is nice for me. It's short, sweet, and simple. Porco, or Marco, is one of my favorite Ghibli protagonists simply because of his charisma and his attitude. In fact, I'd say this entire movie is just oozing with charisma. My favorite character is Fio. She's just a lot of fun and one of the more endearing characters in the company's catalog, and she also has charisma, almost as much as Porco. I think the plain action and movement frames throughout are particularly impressive. This is one of the faster paced Ghibli movies, and it's very easy to see why. This is just a good movie overall, and while it's not my favorite Ghibli film, it's probably the easiest to get invested in and one of the best first watches you could decide for Ghibli. Again, there isn't all too much I can say. The town scenery is great as always. I think the details in towns are just so beautiful, it makes me want to visit countries that I don't really think about visiting. I also like pretty much every character, even the antagonist for once, which is rare for me in Ghibli films. But yeah, this is probably my shortest segment since Porco Rosso isn't really a movie I have too many in-depth thoughts to speak on, since it is a very simple movie and everything you can praise it for can be explained very easily. But through the 1-2 punch in its two primary characters, whether it be Porco's lovable sarcasm and charisma, or Fio's innocent but bold strive for adventure, Porco Rosso is one of the studio's most entertaining installments, which is why I have it ranked as high as I do. With that being said, we're now going to move on to the most recent and technically final Miyazaki movie, even though it's not actually going to be his final movie because you know damn well he's not going to stop making movies, The Boy and the Heron. I already made a video on this film since it just recently came out in the US, and my thoughts on it are still strong. The Boy and the Heron is Miyazaki's most experimental and inventive film, and while that inventiveness doesn't always work in its favor, it also makes me appreciate it more. I will always have at least a little bit more to appreciate and respect about films that take strides in directions I don't expect than in films that are very standard and safe. I love the spiritual journey and self-discovery feel to it. The quieter and more atmospheric setting and main character help it in that way, and while it makes Mahito a little more difficult to connect with, I think that the distance you feel with him at first makes his committing moment by the end of the film hit a lot harder. I do think the ending was a little too abrupt and fast-paced compared to the rest of the film, which does hold it back for me, but with how much it has going for it, I'm more than willing to put it up this high. I adore this film despite some of its flaws, and I'm glad it exists. That's also not to mention that it has one of the best soundtracks in my opinion, and by far Ghibli's best English dub. I'm not going to spend much more time on this since I already said I want to make a longer video analyzing the film in its entirety when it's out digitally, so I'm going to just leave it at that, and move on to our next film, another early Ghibli movie, My Neighbor Totoro. Okay, for one, best theme song easily. Second, Totoro. Third, Cat Bus. Boom, I just gave you all the reasoning you need for its placement. Moving on. Okay, but being for real though, My Neighbor Totoro is one of Ghibli's most magical films. The whimsy and fantasy is its charm, and it's so unapologetically full of childish wonder that it's impossible not to be endeared by it. The main girls are so much fun to hang around with, and Totoro himself is arguably the most lovable creature in all of media entirely. There's a pretty good reason why he's their main trademark and mascot, because it's impossible to just not love the fluffy old puff. It does what I already loved in Ponyo, yet does it better. It's a lovely piece of sentimental storytelling with some of the most heartwarming moments in all of cinema. Despite its fantasy, it's a very grounded and low-stakes story that focuses on family, sisterhood, and the magic of childhood. And what more could you ask for from a movie like this? Like many Ghibli films, it's a simple story elevated to a work of art through Miyazaki's wonderful direction and storyboards and understanding of childhood behavior, and the beautiful painting landscapes to fill the atmosphere. This film is magic in its greatest form and one of Miyazaki's best and most famous films for a reason. Show this to your kids, I promise you it will do wonders for them. And that's My Neighbor Totoro. Let's move on now to our next spot on the list, Nasaka of the Valley of the Wind. I'm a sucker for the type of world that Nasaka is set in. With a great mix of colorful fantasy as well as drab post-apocalyptic science fiction, it's clear to see why this film is as fun as it is for me. It's crazy that this was one of his first ventures as a filmmaker as well, considering how it's still one of his best, and also laid the groundwork for many themes that Miyazaki would explore a lot in his films. Its exploration of how humans affect nature later becomes something that repeats a lot of his films, but very few of them reach the same heights that Nasaka does. The environmentalist themes are handled very well, and Nasaka is one of Ghibli's best and most human protagonists despite how much she's mythologized in the story, which can be a little exhausting at times. While looking at the darker aspects of humanity, and sometimes seeming the most critical out of all of his films, Miyazaki never delves fully into a cynical viewpoint and keeps an optimistic outlook on the potential of a nature-caring future. Add on top of that some great action sequences, you have yourself a good treat. I wouldn't say the cast is the most memorable outside of Nasaka compared to, say, Porco Rosso or Spirited Away, but it's still very engaging with one of the most beautiful worlds in Ghibli, with some of the most nuanced and in-depth world building of them all. This makes it worthy of its high spot to me, despite a few minor issues I've had with it. So now let's move on to Studio Ghibli's most famous and most acclaimed piece, the only Ghibli film to have won an Oscar, Spirited Away. Now, this is a lot of people's number one, and that's for a good reason. The main reason why it isn't for me is just because the three below are more engaging and personal to me. Arguably the best in terms of animation and detail, Spirited Away is one of Miyazaki's most profound works, and its success in becoming such an integral piece of cinema in both its own country and to pretty much every other country in the world is more impressive than you can imagine. Just about every moment and frame from this film is full of different layers and depth in its visual language, and yet it never feels overdone because it's just that beautiful. It never never becomes overwhelming, it's more relaxing than anything. The frames are always full from left to right and top to bottom, and you can screenshot just about any second and it'll always look beautiful. Chihiro and Haku's connection and dynamic is where the heart of the film lies, and they have one of the best 1-2 dynamics in all of Ghibli. Their relationship is sweet and hopeful despite their bittersweet departure, and Haku is probably in my top 3 favorite Ghibli do tags. This is also the richest Ghibli film in terms of cultural representation, with a mythology to it that represents both the beauties and horrors of Japanese folklore. This is one of the most layered Ghibli films, which is why it's so easy to talk about, because you can go on about it for hours without running out of topics. This is one of the biggest reasons for why it's always been relevant since its release, and why it's talked about more than every other film in Ghibli and Miyazaki's catalog. It's one of my favorites, just not my absolute favorite, because while Spirited Away is the film that I think has the most going for it in terms of visual and narrative richness, I still love these next few films a lot more on a personal and narrative point of view. But I still completely understand why Spirited Away is commonly referred to as the best of the bunch. But now we're going to move on to my personal top 3 when it comes to Hayao Miyazaki, and we're going to start that top 3 with Kikis Delivery Service. What can I say? Kikis Delivery Service is just one of my ultimate comfort films. For a while, it was my favorite Ghibli movie. I think I just came across this film at the perfect time because it's one of the best growing up films out there. A very well done coming-of-age tale with probably my favorite Ghibli protagonist in Kiki. She's fun, lovable, and full of charm. Then, not to mention Gigi, my lovable little black cat, and the only Ghibli creature that I own a plush for. The film's story of leaving home unprepared and trying to find your place in a world that's both bigger and smaller than you originally thought it would be resonates with me deeply, and is a theme that, well, came to me at the perfect time. Kiki's independence while also learning to be a more accepting and grateful person to those around her is one of my favorite self-discovery stories out there. Another simple yet effective growing up movie, and is the highest form of Ghibli magic to me. This film elicits just about every happy feeling I can get, and it never fails to make me smile, which is more than enough for me to put it as high as it is. It's very near and dear to my heart and one that I revisit a lot. In fact, it's the one that I revisit the most. I would honestly have it at number 1 because of that if it wasn't for my intoxication with my love for these next 2 films, which I think will surprise many with their placements. Number 2 probably isn't that big of a surprise, it's Princess Mononoke. Many things I praise Nasaka for apply here, but in an even greater sense. This is probably the most bold in terms of, content when it comes to Ghibli, when it comes to Miyazaki, and probably the most ambitious of them all. And well, it succeeds at doing that. While Ashitaka isn't nearly as endearing as, let's say, Nausicaa, San and many of the side cast, including its antagonists, really make the movie what it is for me. No one really feels like a waste here. And even though he isn't my favorite protagonist, Ashitaka meshes with the other cast members very well, and he's at his best when he's with another character rather than on his own, because he helps make pretty much every other character in the film much better. And that's why the latter half of the film is as great as it is, because he's always helping with someone else. His relationship with San and the contrast between him and Lady Eboshi is very intriguing and very multi-layered. And while the film has a very clear and on-the-nose stance on nature and humanity, like Spirited Away, it's full of many layers and cultural mythology to explore that makes it worth talking about for hours. The nature and scenery are beautiful as always, and as a nature lover myself, it's even more enjoyable for me. I mean, just looking at that forest and that lake just elicits this weird feeling of comfort. San is probably my favorite character in all of Ghibli too, and one of my favorite characters in general. And that's another big reason why I love this movie so much, because it gave me this character. Its climax is also probably the strongest I've seen in Miyazaki's work. It's the most ambitious, the most climactic, and just the most entertaining and most hooking. The creature characters are very wise and very intriguing, and the human characters are inexperienced but sincere in their motivations and beliefs. And the world building is probably my favorite outside of Spirited Away. That's not to mention that Miyazaki's passionate environmentalist beliefs are on full display here in its most critical and sincere pedestal. It's a ride from start to finish with many moments to just sit and take in the beauty of nature. Of all Miyazaki movies, this is probably the most Miyazaki movie. The nature that we, for some reason, continue to destroy instead of love and appreciate is what makes this movie so wonderful. For a very long time, this was my favorite Ghibli movie, and I'm still constantly fluctuating between it and my number one spot, which, well, it's about time we get into that now. At our number one spot, probably the most controversial part of this entire video, we have The Wind Rises. Yeah, no, this will definitely be the most controversial placement of anything in this video, possibly more controversial than my Howls Moving Castle placement. But I don't really care. I am very unapologetic in how much I love The Wind Rises. Jiro has the most introspective and in-depth arc of any Ghibli protagonist, which of course makes sense considering he's based on the real Jiro Horikoshi. And yet the film doesn't treat itself like a typical biopic, with dream sequences that showcase the mindset and inspirations of Jiro's life as well as his regrets and emotions, and a story that is almost entirely made up with an original fictional love interest that just so happens to be one of the best and most tragic characters Miyazaki had ever written. It just makes me enamored by this film. If there were a face to describe beauty and sunshine, it would be Naoko. I've also made a video on why this is my favorite Ghibli movie already, but it goes beyond that. This is my favorite anime movie, and is a film that breaks the boundaries of the genre it takes and shows just how much of a master in storytelling Miyazaki is, while also being one of his most personal tales, intertwining Jiro Horikoshi's life with his own. So even though many might disagree with its placement, I will always have The Wind Rises this high up on my list. It is an introspective masterpiece and a wonderful character study that manages to balance wartime commentary, personal commentary, and the animated beauty and magic that Ghibli always delivers. With so many different areas to look into, I have The Wind Rises at number 1, which concludes my ranking of Hayao Miyazaki's entire completed filmography. Once again, I know this list will be a lot more controversial than my Makoto Shinkai ranking, but let's try to be civil here. We all love Ghibli, and I still think every movie I've seen here is at least pretty good. It's just that I love some of these more than others. I mean, in all the other rankings, my main points for why they're low is just because I don't have as much to talk about as the ones that are higher. They aren't that special to me, but Miyazaki as a filmmaker is special to me. If I were to do a full Ghibli ranked video, all of his videos would be nowhere near the last place spot. He's just one of my biggest inspirations as a storyteller, and I love his work. I love all of his work. I am wonderfully intrigued by what the future holds for Ghibli, and hope that whatever future works he makes, however many films he may still have in him, will be worthy additions to what is arguably the best catalog in animated cinema, and just all of cinema in general. And that's going to wrap up my video here. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, comment down below what other filmmakers in anime or just cinema in general that you would like to see me cover and rank, because I'm going to start doing more introspective looks and dives into filmmakers' filmographies and do a lot more rankings this upcoming year. Then of course, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. I did upload this video late, so I do want to say Merry Christmas, late Christmas that is, to everybody who celebrates it, and if you don't celebrate it, well, I still hope you had an amazing few weeks. I also want to say Happy New Year to everybody, since this is going to come out either right after New Year's or right before New Year's. I can't wait to make more content this upcoming year, and let's try and get 10k subscribers by the end of 2024. I think that's something we can reach. We reached 6k, so we can definitely get 10k. Thank you guys for being here again. I love you all. Y'all have a good day. I'll see y'all next time.